this lecture, we're going to be considering the founding of Buddhism. Buddhism was founded by an Indian prince named Siddhartha Gautama. He's also known as Shakyamuni because he was a member of the Shakya tribe, and he lived in the 4th, 5th century BCE. The story goes that when the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was an infant, there was a prophecy made that he would either become a great political leader or the savior of the world. His father, being royalty, thought the first option sounded a lot better than the latter, so he did what he could to ensure that his son would follow in his own footsteps and try to be an important political leader. So he thought the best strategy for doing this was to give him a very sheltered life, make him see life in a palace is really a pretty good thing. And as a result of being sheltered, Siddhartha never really encountered anyone who was sick or suffering. So when he in fact did at one point leave the palace, he was really amazed to find people that were not doing so well. Poor people, people that did have some disease. He saw a corpse and was completely stunned because he'd been at that point protected from the idea that people died. And he was particularly stunned to hear that this was something that princes had happened to them too, that no one managed to get through life without ultimately dying, and that usually people somehow suffered along the way. So in his reaction to this, which was an extremely strong reaction, Siddhartha opted for different approaches to living to see what he could do to solve what he saw as a major problem. It seemed that life really didn't have any meaning if this is what it came to. So one course he took for a while was to be an ascetic. This was not an unusual move. After all, we talked about how renouncing the world and moving off into the forest and gradually no longer having anything to do with ordinary relations with others was basically a certain stage of life as far as Brahmanic thought went. So he tried that, but it didn't really solve the problem of suffering. Indeed, it kept him detached from some cases where he might have experienced it, but it struck him that this really wasn't any solution to the problem. So he tried the other extreme, hedonism, the eat, drink, and be merry approach. Certainly this is one that occurs to people in many cultures. If one has the idea that maybe this is the only life and maybe suffering is going to come at the end of it anyway, make hay while the sun shines. Go ahead and go for the good life. But this didn't solve the problem either, not certainly in any permanent way. So ultimately, Siddhartha came to the view that a middle way was the appropriate way to understand the world. And he developed a vision of this. He became enlightened, and his way of expressing the vision that he had is known as the Four Noble Truths. The term Buddha actually just means enlightened. So to say that Siddhartha Gautama is the Buddha means that he is the enlightened one. And his vision was something that he attempted to teach to others. And so the Four Noble Truths, he thinks, indicate the method for resolving the problem of suffering in the world. The first noble truth is life is dukkha. Now, what does dukkha mean? It means approximately suffering. But suffering here includes a lot of things that we might not quite call suffering, but they're certainly part of this picture. For example, pain of any sort. I mean, some pains aren't really that acute. We wouldn't quite say we're suffering when we experience them. But nevertheless, it's part of a package that is unpleasant, not satisfying, something that makes life seem not quite right. Sickness certainly falls into this category. Death, obviously, would strike Siddhartha Gautama as something in this category. But some other things that we might not initially think of, too, are part of the picture of life as dukkha. Being aware of the fact that life is transient. A lot of times people imagine that animals, in a sense, have a better life than people because they don't know they're going to die. You have a dog. The dog is happy every day. Even if the dog is sick, it still basically doesn't have any sense of a future, even if it's terminally ill. And it's kind of hard not to think, gee, that would be kind of a nice state of ignorance to be in. But human beings are aware that their lives are transient. In fact, a lot of times when we get what we want, some goal or other is fulfilled, we realize, well, either the sheen wears off or maybe it doesn't last forever. Somebody gets, as I was talking about in the last lecture, a new car that they really want. Well, eventually that new car starts to deteriorate. This just doesn't seem right. Obviously, too, a lot of times we have desires that aren't fulfilled. Being frustrated is a kind of everyday circumstance for lots of people. This, too, is part of the overall set of troubles that afflict human life. And all kinds of emotional distresses of various sorts. Someone near us dies or is suffering. We can't keep ourselves away from the sort of distress that we see all around us. Even if things are going pretty well for us, we interact with people and other beings who aren't doing too well, and that brings us down. Now, as the Buddha understands this, all of this set of problems, these quite wide-ranging kinds of problems that he views as part of dukkha, or the suffering of life, come about because we're attached to existence. In other words, what we want is to have a secure personal self. And we tend to view ourselves, and this is something that certainly is consistent with Brahmanic thought, we view ourselves as something separate from other beings, other people. And so what we would like is for us personally to be secure. And this just isn't very realistic. As Siddhartha came to see it, there really is no such self. Now, in a way, that's perhaps a strange thing to say, though we might be a little accustomed to it right now because we've been talking about Brahmanism, which asserts something similar. But the way the Buddha saw this was slightly different from the way Brahmanic thinkers tend to think of it. As he sees it, what we find, if we just look around us, is nothing that continues in the same form at all. Instead, we see lots of different processes going on. If you think about yourself, he asks, well, what are you thinking about? You're really thinking about a configuration, maybe at this moment, of a bunch of different processes. For example, we might think of our bodies. Well, our bodies are certainly a matter of processes. If only thinking about the changes in your body from the time that you were an infant to now, it's pretty clear that processes are going on all the time. Supposedly every cell in our body changes every 7 years. So in a sense, you're a different person materially than you were 7 years ago, completely. Again, there have been processes going on. It might not be that we focus on all of them, but nevertheless, it's pretty clear that there are processes that we have been changing in various ways over time, physically. Also, sensations are processes. We have certain kinds of experiences. They have a trajectory of certain sorts. I eat something delicious, a certain taste goes off in my mouth, it lingers for a while, then it goes away. There are all kinds of processes that are going on continually. And at any given moment, that's going to be what I notice when I think of myself. What I perceive mentally, the sorts of ideas that I have, those too are constantly going by. In fact, you might even think of something like a script going by with lots of different thoughts, some of them seeming to come from out of the blue. It's pretty clear that what you're thinking about isn't exactly the same all the time. And then, of course, there are desires and impulses. Oftentimes we have some overriding desire that makes us think, well, this is what I'm concentrating on, this is my goal, and I'm just going to go for it. But, as we've discussed previously, if you get what it is that you think you want in that case, that doesn't put an end to all desires. You get tired of it, maybe. Or it isn't something that lasts for very long. Suppose you want to get elected, I don't know, chairman of some board that you're serving on. Well, maybe you are, but then somebody's elected later on in a different year. It's not something that's permanent. And whatever goal it is that we have, that doesn't prevent new desires from coming up. So those too are processes. Consciousness, just awareness in general, is filled with all kinds of things that are coming into our attention and moving out of our attention. And we can go back and forth sometimes. I mean, sometimes when you're driving, it's good to be aware of where the vehicle in the next lane is, but you shouldn't direct your attention entirely to it. So you kind of keep fluttering back and forth. Again, you get a sense of just processes, not anything stable. And the Buddha's view is if you try to find yourself or any other person, you really can't find anything stable. It's just configurations of all these processes moving around. But we resist change. We would really like for things to be stable. We would like the idea that we can get to a point where we don't have to worry about anything anymore. So this moves us to the second noble truth. There is an explanation of suffering, and it basically comes from a single root, which is selfish craving. Now, it's important to understand that the Buddha is not claiming that anything we might call a desire or an impulse is a bad thing. When he talks about the root of suffering being selfish craving, we should put a lot of emphasis on selfish. It's not a kind of bad thing or something that is causing suffering to feel like taking a nap if we're really tired or getting some food if we're hungry. All those things are perfectly normal, natural aspects of the kind of structure that we are, even if it is a process. But most of the time, we have lots of selfish desires that are all geared to the sense of being an individual. We're greedy. We want to get a kind of good deal for ourselves as individuals. And we have a false sense that if we do the right things, we can make our personal life a lot better. And so most of the kinds of aims that we have are really misguided aims to make ourselves permanent. But there is no permanent self. We can't make a permanent self, and since we can't make that self in the first place, we certainly can't secure a position for ourselves. What's wrong with this picture is that we're really ignorant. Again, that word avidya comes up. We're ignorant of the interrelationship of things. If we talk about ourselves just as a bunch of processes, as I did just a little bit ago, it's true that we can sort of think of ourselves that way, but it's still kind of easy to think of ourselves as having certain boundaries, like, okay, some cells come, some cells go, but basically it's still me. It's still this kind of complete package, and it's, in a sense, me against the world. Siddhartha Gautama comes to realize that there isn't really that kind of sharp distinction between the individual and the world. That that's, in fact, what part of the false picture is. That the processes implicate whatever you think of as yourself in the flow of the rest of the world. And what's wrong when we start to think of ourselves as really something separate is that we start to view the external as as a problem in some sense. For example, we think of ourselves as one thing and something out there is something we want. So that becomes a big agenda and we get ourselves all worked up about that. Or we imagine that there's something out there that's not only not really connected to me, but if it does have any relationship to me, it's a threat. Something out there can harm me. I can get very worked up about that. And what all of this misses is the fact that the individual and what seems to be external are all part of a single system. So there isn't a reality corresponding to my notion of me against the world. Whatever I am is part of this flow of the world. A big problem with craving these selfish desires, too, is that they form habits. The more we get to be someone who's pretty greedy, the more likely we are to want something. Tolstoy has a story about a man who keeps thinking, well, things would be really good and he'd feel secure if he had a little more land. So he keeps buying land. His life gets more and more bent out of shape in the process. I mean, he starts viewing getting land as the be-all, end-all of his existence. So he keeps doing all kinds of things that have really robbed his life of any meaning, but instead he just focuses on getting more land. And the final line is, ultimately, 6 feet was enough. He's wasted his life, Tolstoy is suggesting, just because he had this sense that, well, if he just got a little bit more, then things would be fine. It doesn't psychologically work like that. The more we get hooked on this idea that one more external thing is going to make the complete difference, well, suppose we get it, we realize, well, that didn't quite do it, maybe one more, and it just keeps going. So this process is going to continue as long as the selfish craving continues. So the third noble truth is suffering will cease if craving ceases. In other words, if we stop this whole mechanism of selfish craving, then all these senses of suffering, of our life being unsatisfying or filled with troubles, will go away. And part of the idea is to recognize that there is no my life as opposed to others' lives. The whole system is something that has to do with me. So taking that on board, the whole picture changes. It doesn't make any sense to try to get ahead at somebody else's expense if you view everybody else as part of your world too, and their suffering as your own, something that's part of you. I mean, you can only really compete effectively if you view the other person you're competing with as somebody whose success or failure isn't really your concern. And certainly their success may be your concern, but only in that you don't want that to happen because you want this to happen to you. But if you view yourself as connected to them, this doesn't really get you anywhere. If you view somebody being distressed as having an impact on you, this isn't going to be something that is really satisfying to you either. So the whole goal of the third noble truth is eliminate the precondition of all this suffering. Eliminate the idea that you're a separate individual with your own goals and with the possibility of getting ahead at the expense of others. The situation of extinguishing craving of this selfish sort is called nirvana. In fact, nirvana simply means extinction. Sometimes that gives people a very negative sense of what Buddhism is about. There are some difficulties conceptualizing, I think, some of these ideas. But the idea here is not, just to kind of get rid of everything. But the idea instead is to get rid of these cravings, get rid of this whole psychological structure that is causing ourselves and others to feel all kinds of stress and strain in life. If you actually do succeed in getting rid of craving in this sense, the result is blissful. So even though the word nirvana is the negative term meaning extinction, the idea of what comes in its place is bliss. This bliss comes through having a new vision. And the fourth noble truth has to do with what that vision and the consequences of having the vision are. The fourth noble truth is that the method for going about the process of eliminating selfish craving is the Eightfold Path. So there are 8 parts of it. The first part of the Eightfold Path is right thought. Now, right thought here doesn't mean just sort of thinking clearly. Although that may help, understanding what the Buddha says may help, at least you have the potential to see what he's saying. It's more important to have the vision that he's suggesting in what he's talking about. In other words, if you really see things as they are, if you do see yourself as interconnected with absolutely everybody else, with everything else that you encounter, then you aren't likely to think it's going to be really worth my while to try to get something at someone else's expense, for example. In a way, it's almost like checkmate in chess. If you really see that you're going to suffer if you cause suffering to someone else, even though your goal might be just to make things better for you, it doesn't seem like such a good goal anymore. It really doesn't make you feel a lot better when you recognize that you're bringing about distress and this is part of your world too. So to start seeing things as interconnected as they actually are is what right thought is really about. And if you have this vision, sort of thinking it through should fall into place. But it's not enough just to have the vision. The second of the Eightfold Path is right resolve. In other words, having the intention to live according to the vision. Again, it's possible to sort of see what the point of interconnection is. Yes, I recognize that I'm interconnected with other people. And so if I do something that's harmful to them, this doesn't improve my situation, certainly not absolutely. I mean, it's very irritating, for example, to have to continue to deal with somebody who feels slighted and so on. Well, we can understand that. But that's not yet still resolving to live in accordance with a sense that we really are all interconnected. So having the right intention, the intention to make this fully a part of our life, to really incorporate it, is the second of the Eightfold Path. The third is right speech. If you are making this vision part of your life, then your activities in specific ought to be something that accords with it as well. So if you really believe that we're all interconnected, then you should use speech in a way that reflects that. So using speech to harm people would be something that wouldn't make a lot of sense on that vision. Gossiping about people or lying about people or just lying, period, is not really reflecting the fact that you're bound up with everybody else. So misleading people just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Again, what's in back of misleading people is usually a sense that I can somehow get ahead by this. But again, it's ignoring the fact that there's a real deep connection between everyone and everything. To use speech properly, to use it well, to use it to help people, that's the way speech ought to be used if you really take this vision seriously. Similarly, behavior in general, living in a way that doesn't harm others, sort of deciding in your action, is somebody going to be harmed by what I'm doing? That would be a basic way of carrying this out. Or similarly, is someone going to be helped by this? It's not just a negative notion, but instead, if you really understand that it's all one system, then helping others to thrive is really what you'd be naturally inclined to do. I mean, insofar as you do have desires for yourself to thrive in a general way, if you really recognize your connections, then helping others to thrive is something that naturally flows from that. Right livelihood is another of the the Eightfold Path. And here the idea is conduct your career in a way that is, again, in accordance with this overall picture. This would rule out some kinds of jobs. Being a drug dealer would not be a right livelihood on the Buddhist vision. Why? Well, because it certainly doesn't avoid harm. It causes harm. It's sort of predicated on the idea that harming others is going to get you ahead. You might get rich by selling people something that's going to damage them. Well, this would be something that would be ruled out as even a possible way of life that could be consistent with the Buddhist vision. But there are, of course, lots of ways of life that could be quite consistent with it. And so the idea is whatever career you do have, assuming it's one that's possible to conduct in a way that tries to help others thrive and not harm them, to do this in a spirit that recognizes all these interconnections. Again, kind of working just with the idea of getting yourself certain goods would not be a very Buddhist approach any more than it would be a Brahmanistic approach according to the Bhagavad Gita. What is desirable here is viewing your role in the system as something that's really trying to enhance others. The seventh of the Eightfold Path is right effort. And here the focus, this is the sixth. The focus here is good states of mind, trying to develop certain good states of mind and sustaining them. It's not going to be very helpful to try to do all the correct things without keeping this vision fully in mind. So developing the right attitudes to support that vision are important. Similarly, you might notice that you have some bad habits in this regard. You're just kind of accustomed to doing things out of a spirit of selfish craving. Well, again, to notice when that's happening and to try to do what you can to make the effort to change the way you orient yourself is what this is all about. Seventh is right mindfulness. And here the emphasis is really on paying attention to your own psychological states. A lot of times what interferes with maintaining the vision of interconnection of all and the effort to feel compassion for others is that you're just not very attentive to what you're doing. Sometimes what you do or what you say just seems a perfectly appropriate sort of thing to say. And it's what popped into your mind, so you said it. But if you're mindful, you might think, well, gee, actually I was trying to hurt somebody there. Or actually I was trying to get ahead at someone else's expense. I was trying to make other people recognize that this person is doing something that is a little bit shaky, maybe not something that we ought to really trust. And I'm trying to elevate myself in other people's minds at the same time. To notice things like that is really vital in maintaining this kind of vision and behaving according to it. Because a lot of times we have all kinds of habits that we don't pay much attention to. And without some attention, they're never going to change. Finally, right meditation, or concentration, sometimes this is translated as, is the eighth of the Eightfold Path. What we need to do is purify the mind, make the mind a perfect vehicle for realizing this Buddhist vision. Now, one word, in a way, summarizes the whole idea that the Buddha has, namely compassion. When the Buddha came to recognize that the problem in trying to solve suffering the way he had been thinking of it, as an ascetic, he was trying to detach himself so he wouldn't suffer. As a hedonist, he was trying to throw himself into things so he'd kind of forget the fact that life was short and then we die. Neither of those was really the appropriate response, in part because it was a selfish kind of project. He could see himself vulnerable, and he tried to go to extreme measures to make himself more secure, or at least not allow ideas in that are going to upset him. But to fully recognize that everybody is bound up together allows one to see that it's this project of trying to secure things for yourself and view other people as either sort of means to making life better for you or possible threats to the well-being of your life. That's what's mistaken. And in fact, if you just observe the world, the way things are interconnected and flowing into each other all the time, the way people influence each other, is so obvious that cultivating that view is the important thing. And once you do, you're going to feel compassion for others. It's not possible to continue to maintain a view of others as potential threats if you view them as essentially part of the same thing you are. So the whole project of taking on board the insights of the Four Noble Truths is to facilitate this spirit of compassion. Now, the Eightfold Path, I should say, involves 8 different sorts of ways to approach cultivating this vision and maintaining it. But it shouldn't be thought that it's a sequence. Certainly, probably the easiest sequence you could imagine would be to have the full vision, really be good at maintaining it, and then all these other things fall into place. But it's not as if people's habits usually change that easily. So it may be that even though you see the point of this and sometimes have a really strong sense that, yes, actually we are all connected, it's still kind of hard to maintain that in your everyday life. So these are sort of 8 different approaches to ways of enhancing and sustaining that vision. It might be important that sometimes just to understand it theoretically. I mean, sometimes if you're really accustomed to doing things selfishly, it may be that you're not going to be suddenly moved with a full-blown spirit of compassion. You might still have a lot of tendencies to really, well, you know, I feel for them, but that's not what you want, but nevertheless, it takes some effort to get there. So the various parts of the Eightfold Path are different aspects of life that are somehow connected to this attempt to get to this vision. So what we're trying to do, if we follow the Eightfold Path, is purify our motives and develop the right habits. And as those habits become more appropriate to the vision, presumably the vision itself will be easier to sustain and eventually simply become the way that you relate to the world. The Buddha understood what he was doing as something tremendously practical. I think it's important to keep that in mind, especially if you just sort of list the Eightfold Path. It looks like, well, this is a very detailed analysis. He, according to legend, he was preaching and said, suppose your house caught on fire. Would you sit around and discourse about the nature of fire, or would you go put out the fire? Or suppose someone shot an arrow into you. Would you start discussing and considering the nature of arrows and what they do, or would you try to deal with the wound? His view is that the Eightfold Path is much more practical than perhaps it initially looks like. This is how, you know, wherever you're starting, utilizing these ideas, you can find a way of dealing with the problem of suffering. So it's intended to be very practical. Along with this notion of it being very practical is a sense that it's really something very much involved with each of our personal lives. The idea isn't to sort of look at things at a distance and say, you know, well, yes, you know, everybody's psychology is like this. In a way, pretending that you yourself are the authority on it, but not necessarily someone that it's describing. Here the idea is to try to take on board the insight and figure out in your own way of life how to make this insight really crucial to your actual way of life. The big vision here is that we need to change our values in order to change the fact of human suffering. But if we do change our values, that's what's actually going to be conducive to changing the fact that the world is full of suffering, and that's true both of us and everybody we encounter. So even though to some people this sounds like a rather almost ascetic vision, trying not to be greedy, say, trying to restrain yourself. That isn't the goal. The goal is to reorient your life in a way that's really optimistic, in a way that's conducive to bringing about a world without suffering, not just for yourself, but for everybody that's bound to you.